All right. Good morning, everyone, from the beautiful and sunny but cold city of Melbourne. I do have the greatest pleasure of presenting to you Andrea, who's sort of one of our newest recruits. So she started, I think Andrea started in March, is that right?
Yes, I did on the 30th of March.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So, in the midst of the pandemic, crazy times, confusion, having to work from home, but she is now part of the furniture, that's for sure. And we love Andrea, and I'll tell you why we love Andrea for all kinds of reasons. But one of them is that she's been able to, she works in marketing, but she's been able to get a series of seminars off the ground that have been extremely successful for one of our departments. And we thought, why not do them for language services? And when we started thinking about what to present, we thought a really good thing to talk about would be languages. And in the context of Australian community, of course. So what I've asked Andrea to do is prepare a presentation about Spanish. And as we were working through the presentations, I've learned so many things about the Spanish languages, which I hope Andrea will be able to share with you today. But firstly, what I wanted to do is ask Andrea about her background, because Andrea is Spanish speaking, and she comes from Venezuela in South America. And she's really well placed to talk about cultures and languages because she's a former journalist. So over to you, Andrea. Firstly, tell us about who you are and how to pronounce your surname, because that's a lesson I got this morning. It's pronounced Montilla, which I wouldn't have guessed, not being a Spanish speaker. So over to you, Andrea.
Yes, thank you so much, Eva. I'm really excited about being part of this live sessions today. I'm quite nervous, but I'm also very happy to be part of this and being part of Polaron. And yes, my background is from Venezuela, from South America, so north part of South America. And I speak Spanish as a native speaker. And my surname is actually Montilla, which I try to pronounce like that in Australia. But when an English speaker try to pronounce my surname, they just say Montilla because the double L is not like a normal thing to say, but it's actually Montilla. And if you ask, let's say, an Argentinian, probably they will say Montilla, which sounds different, but it's not incorrect. It's also correct. Yeah.
So I think one of the things we are going to be covering is Spanish as a language, and you're going to give us a little bit of history, just a little bit of history, a little bit about different Spanishes, because just like with English, there are varieties of Spanish. So it's a language that's mutually intelligible. In other words, if someone's from Spain and someone from Argentina, they'll be able to understand each other very easily. Just like Americans can understand Australians, but there may be differences in accents. So could you tell us a bit more about the language? And one of the most surprising things I learned, even though I work with languages day in and day out, is that it's the second most spoken native language in the world. So that's massive. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so you would think that maybe English or Chinese is the second most spoken native language in the world, but it's actually Spanish. So at the moment, there are more than 450 million Spanish speakers around the world. That makes us the second most spoken native language. Apart from the people, for the number of people that are speaking Spanish as a second language, which are about 75 million people. And that means at least 21 countries around the world speak Spanish as a first language. That includes around 19 American countries from North America, Central America, and South America. But also we should include one country from Africa, but also obviously Spain. and around 60% of the population in Latin America speaks Spanish, which doesn't mean it's it's not 100% of the people that speak Spanish, because we need to also mention that Brazilian people, they don't speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese.
Okay. And so the diaspora, so apart from people that speak native Spanish, there are, it's a native language, I guess. If you go to America, let's say, or United States, there are heaps of people that speak Spanish as a second language, I guess, or a language that they've learned from their parents or grandparents, even though they were born there. So the diaspora is very, very big, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So because of the proximity we have with the United States, there is a huge population that still speaks Spanish as a first language, or at least as a second language. I did a research just a bit, and there's around 31 million people in United States speaking Spanish as their first language. And let's say if you go to Florida, 90% of people are speaking Spanish. You try to speak to them and they won't reply to you in English. They might reply to you in Spanish, which is kind of weird because you're in an English speaking country, but it's actually very common in the United States.
That's true. I was in Florida earlier this year in January, and I found it really interesting because, when I was booking my Uber, I would get messages in Spanish through the app. And of course, a lot of communication from signage to websites to everything is in Spanish, because that's really the second language. So around 10% of US population speaks Spanish. And would you agree that it's a language that's relatively easy for English speakers to learn?
It is, actually it is. There's a lot of people, English speakers, that are learning Spanish, and they already know that language as a second language. It's quite easy to learn and understand, because it comes from the Latin or the Romance languages, which are very similar, for example, with the French or the Italian. I'll let you know about this a little bit later.
Yeah,
But
we
yeah,
can
it
move
is
on.
very, yeah, it's very easy to understand and to learn.
So when we were said the one happy family, it's not strictly true, is it? Because I think, and you're going to cover that later, that there are regional variations of Spanish. But if you could tell us about where the language originated, I guess, and what language family it belongs to.
Yeah, so most of the people know that Spanish language comes from Spain, and it's a very old language. But it wasn't the only, or it still is not the only language that is spoken in Spain. The Spanish language originated from Spain in the late 15th century, but before that there were so many other languages or dialects that were spoken in Spain. So, for example, what is Catalan or Aragonese? I'll let you know about that later. But in terms of the original Spanish, yeah, it originated in the late 15th century, when the kingdom of Castile and Leon merged with the Aragon kingdom, and the Spanish became the official language of Spain. And actually, Spanish is not the only name that you can call this language. So you can also call it Castilian. So if you, for example, ask a Latin American people or person which language they speak, they might tell you, well, if they're in Australia, they will tell you Spanish. But if you're in Latin America, they might tell you they speak Castellano, which is
Okay.
Castilian, yeah, in English. It's just another name that we call, and Spanish is thereby from the Castilian, which is a very old dialect and still valid and spoken in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. And it is a Romance language with links to Italian and French and Portuguese, you said there, and
Yeah.
Catalan.
Yes. So they all derive from the same root, which is like Latin or Romance languages. That's how we call it. And actually that means we are very closely related to those languages, and even we can a little bit understand each other. If I speak with an Italian person or French person, I might be able to understand or pick up some words, because there's so many similarities between those languages. And with the Portuguese people, I mean, with the Brazilian people who speak Portuguese, we can even maintain a conversation with them.
Okay.
Even me speaking Spanish and they speak in Portuguese at the same time, and we can actually understand each other a little bit.
So they're linguistically quite close. And I think you're going to be covering that later, but there are languages spoken in Spain. Oh, here we go. And also indigenous languages of Latin America that are completely different and mutually unintelligible. So, for example, a language like Basque, that's a completely, that you cannot understand. A Spanish speaker wouldn't be able to understand a Basque speaker, or there's not many commonalities. Is that right?
Well, actually, we could understand each other a little bit, but not 100%. But there's some similarities in terms of words and, yeah, like the accent or maybe the words itself, like the vocabulary. But yeah, it is surprisingly, I found that Spanish is not being spoken as a main language for the entire Spain. So basically, there are regional languages or dialects that are being spoken still in Spain for minority of people, but still is very important. For example, Galician or Leonese or even Basque or Catalan. But yeah, we still have some similarities, because basically the Spanish or the Castilian language comes from the Catalan, the Galician. There's a mix in between. So yeah,
Okay,
there's still some.
But the indigenous languages of Latin America, they'd be completely different, right? Or do they still, because I guess, I don't know how to put it, but I guess the Spanish language and the culture is dominant and kind of a little bit suppressant. So I guess in a country like Spain, there are movements to try and preserve the old languages. So I know, for example, that there's a language called Ladino that we've discussed, which is a language used by Jewish people, and it's got Spanish influences. But it's a dialect on its own. And I guess if we look at Latin America, these languages are very ancient and they predate Spanish influences. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, in the right-hand side corner, you will see I just put the main dialects that are spoken in Latin America. So basically, there are indigenous languages that are still that survived throughout the history, but they have been highly influenced by the Spanish language when the Spanish Empire conquered the whole South America and Central America. And but this specific indigenous language still survive right now. But yeah, obviously there's a lot of influence from the Spanish language. For example, the Quechua, that's one of the biggest, I mean, the biggest group that still speak this language is the Quechua, that are spoken in Peru or Ecuador, just the Andean region. Can you believe there's around 6 to 7 million people speaking this language?
Oh, wow.
That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean it's the main language, but they're still spoken. There's a lot of tradition in there. Same for Mayan, which is the other indigenous language spoken in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention something else about Spanish and the influences. Now that we are touching base on this, on the influences. So obviously there has been influences from the English language, but also the Spanish language has influenced the English language. As an English speaker, you will see, for example, there's a lot of similarities, and I've been surprised by the fact that the English speakers, they know more Spanish languages that they can even know. And there are over 3,000 words that are shared by English and Spanish speakers. It's unbelievable. So, for example, there are a lot of words borrowed from English. So in Spanish, we use words like jeans or words like hotel. We don't say hotel, we say hotel, but still it's the same word.
And how would you
So
pronounce
many of it.
jeans? Do you maintain the English pronunciation, or does it
Same
become
pronunciation, jeans.
okay? So you
Yeah.
wouldn't pronounce it hints or something like that. Okay, that's just
No,
me
we
ignorant.
just
Okay,
keep the same pronunciation. It's
right,
weird because if you try to say in exact Spanish, it will say hands,
right. It just
but it's
doesn't make
weird for
sense.
us. It doesn't make sense for us. For us, it will always say it will always be jeans.
Okay.
Yeah. Even if it's blue jean, color blue will say blue jean. I'm gonna wear a blue jean. Yeah, we'll still use that. And in Spanish, in English, there's a lot of words that were borrowed from Spanish. So, for example, when you use tornado, tornado is actually a Spanish word, or patio, or cafeteria. But in Spanish, we say cafeteria.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how languages can influence each other.
Hmm. Do you find, Andrea, that more and more English finds its way into Spanish, and to do with social media, computers, technology? Like, is there a lot of words that are being borrowed sort of recently in the last few years, as they're being invented? I think in the world.
Yes, definitely. So from the fact that we are more using like social media networks, we are being influenced a lot uh, from English languages and even French. For example, in Spanish, let me just say one of the examples that comes to my mind now. When we talk about Twitter, we just made up a word that is tuitear from
Okay.
Twitter, and which doesn't make sense in Spanish, but actually it's being used from, by young people a lot. I'm tweeting like, yeah, like using a verb, using like Twitter, tuitear. That's a verb or
Right,
an
so it's kind
action.
of been bastardized a little bit, and made into something that doesn't really exist in either of the languages. So they take English and make it into a Spanish word. And I think that happens to a lot of languages. So Spanish is not unique, but it's really interesting to hear that that's a language of younger people. I guess that's where this conversation starts, and someday someone makes up a word, then explodes and makes it into vocabulary and becomes a thing, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it's more natural than we think now. And even if we use like more English words, we understand that mainly they're being used by young people, but everyone can relate. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, right now we can say social media in Spanish. You can
Mm-hmm.
say that phrase in Spanish, and even just an English phrase, we can use it in Spanish, especially within migrant community, let's say in Australia or in the United States. We are heavily influenced by the English language.
Mm-hmm.
As we commonly say, sometimes we forget words in Spanish and we forget words in English and we just mix them up, which is not ideal, because the idea is to keep your language as virgin as possible or as natural as possible. But you cannot deny that when you migrate to an speaking country, you will mix it up and
Mm-hmm.
you will need to use some English words, but people will understand you even if there are English speakers or yeah,
And of course, that's called Spanglish. And I remember
English.
seeing a film that was very, very lame, but called Spanglish. But at the bottom of your slide there, you talk about Arabic that's influenced Spanish over centuries, and the same thing's happening with English and in many other languages where words are borrowed, slightly changed, or they make into vocabulary kind of organically. And sometimes it's a little bit unpredictable, and it just depends how it happens and who grabs it. And now in the era of social media, things spread very quickly. So I think in your next slide, you are covering types of Spanish, because that's the kind of question that we get asked a lot, given that it's spoken in 21 different countries and everyone's slightly different. The question we get as a translation company is often, okay, do you need to translate in different Spanishes? Like, could you maybe explain to us whether there are different varieties of Spanish, and how would that affect decisions made around translation?
Yeah, so it's very common for me and for many Spanish speakers to get asked about the origin of the Spanish, or even saying to you like, oh, you speak Spanish, so you're from Spain. Actually, no. Well, yes, I have a background from Spain, but I'm not from Spain. I just speak Spanish or Castilian, yeah. But in terms of if there's a such thing as a type of Spanish, I would say there's not such thing. There's only one Spanish language, but we should say there are clear distinctions between the varieties of Spanish, in terms of the use of vocabulary, in terms of accent, even in terms of slangs and colloquialism. I just wanted to mention some of those distinctions. There's many more than that, but just the most important one. um, but I just wanted to say also that all Spanish speakers can all understand each other. I mean, most of the time. It depends, but if you're speaking in Spanish with a Latin American accent, or yeah, and if you go to Spain to speak with your Spanish from Latin America, you will be able to be understood. I mean, you can maintain a conversation normally, as you will do in Latin America. So there's no issue with that.
Is it a political, sorry to jump in there, is it a political issue sometimes? Because I think it also depends who you ask, because I'm looking at the words you put up there on the screen. So, I think that refers to a mobile phone or a cell phone. And I guess that depends where the words come from or which English, right? Because one might be American English, the other one may be Spanish, or from Spain. Like, it's a very interesting conversation from a sort of like socio-political point of view, not just linguistic.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not so sure about it, but if you compare with Spanish, Latin American Spanish, sorry, with the Spanish from Spain, you will see like there's clear difference between the vocabulary we use, but we'll say that basically there are synonyms. So, for example, in Spain, they usually use the word or the phrase teléfono móvil to refer to a cell phone. But in Latin America, we usually use celular. But that doesn't mean that if you use teléfono móvil in Latin America, they won't understand you. They will. It's just like it's just a different way to
variation.
Yeah, it's just a regional variation. It might come from a social political thing. I'm not so sure about it, but it might be. Same for another example. For example, for computer in Spain or any other specific regions in Latin America, they might use ordenador as a word to refer to computer. But if you go to Latin America, we use computadora or computador. But it's basically the same. You can use both variations. It doesn't matter. But yeah, in terms of, for example, the voceo, which is the use of vos or tu, that means more that it's more related to the cultural thing, like the use of more
Formality?
polite or informal, yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
formality. So the use of formality or informality in a conversation. So for example, in Argentina, when someone wants to ask you where are you from, they will say de donde sos, using sos at the end. That's very formal, and that's very particular from Argentina, from Paraguay, or from Uruguay.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go to the other part of Latin America, they will say de donde eres to refer to where you from. That's more informal. So,
Okay.
but doesn't mean one is correct and one is incorrect. Not at all.
Okay.
It's just
Okay.
a way of saying it culturally.
Okay, because we are going to move on to the next slide, which will tell us about those differences in a bit more detail, but also we will move on to, because we actually don't have a lot of time left, believe it or not, we'll move on to what happens in translation. So the first thing is that the Spanish language expands. Sorry, if we could go back, I think we've perfect. So when you translate English, you'll end up with more words by about 20%, sometimes more in the Spanish language. And there are symbols in the Spanish language that are different than English. And maybe you could briefly tell us about those?
Yes, in terms of translation, when you want to convert an English text into Spanish, usually the text will expand a lot. It's between 15 to 25%. That doesn't mean we are using, I mean, longer sentences. Well, kind of, yes, but that means sometimes we don't have a proper translation from one word to another. Let me just tell you, for example, we don't, for the word clockwise, we don't have a word for clockwise, like one word.
So you have to explain
In
it.
Spanish, we need to explain that in the direction of the needles of the clock, which is obviously in English, we say clockwise, that's it. But in Spanish, we need to explain it. It's more descriptive, yes, somehow.
Right, right. And I think it's especially for concepts that don't really exist in the Spanish language. So here I'm sort of thinking about, say, community services or government translations where, concepts of things like carer or, any of those that we in the mainstream are very used to, but don't actually either exist or they have to be just explained is the word that I would use here. That just contributes to the expansion of the language. And Andrea, can I call you Andrea Nita, or what's that about? Can you explain to me the diminutives?
Yes, yeah. So actually, the diminutives that means we use it a lot in Spanish. So that means we are, just warm people, friendly. So for my name, you can say Andreita
Andreita. Okay,
with
I'm
the
going to use
ita
that from
at
now
the
on.
end. That means
Andreita.
like little Andrea. It's
Oh,
just
so cute.
yeah, yeah. It's just cute. It's just to
Okay,
say you're cute. I care about you. Yeah.
okay.
So same for love. We use the word amor. You can say amorcito.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a diminutive. Yeah.
Oh, and there are characters in the Spanish language that, if not used correctly, will mean something completely different, potentially offensive. So they have a word, you have a letter N with a accent above it, and that's pronounced what? Any? What's that?
Yeah. So the exact letter is ñ. It's
Mm-hmm.
very unique and very particular from Spanish. It's not even used in any other language, as far as I know, and it's very important because if you miss that letter, you might change the meaning of the word completely.
So one of the words that I know in Spanish, although I don't speak it, of course, is El Nino. That's made itself into English, and that's got that particular accent about the N. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you need to use that letter to be able to say niño when you're using in a text, in a written text. But if you say nino with n only, that doesn't mean anything in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing.
Okay, and now the question mark and exclamation mark is something that people that will see Spanish text will find surprising because it goes at the beginning and at the end of the
Yeah.
sentence, right?
Yeah, it's very
And one's
particular
upside
also.
down. Are
Yeah,
they
it's
both
like an
upside down? Or?
inverted, it's like an inverted exclamation mark and question
Okay.
mark.
Okay.
Very particular in Spanish, and it's also very important because that means there's a question that is going to begin now. You know, it's
Okay.
like just it's just a heads up. You know, there's a question to come. Be careful.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what's next? So we are going to cover the Spanish-speaking community in Australia and Victoria, and then if people want any other question, you have any other questions about other communities in New South Wales or other states, they can contact us. But this I found fascinating. I was really quite surprised as to where Spanish sits, in top 10 languages, and how it's actually grown in the 5 years from 2011 and 16. Do you know, or could you tell us why that is? Why that sort of grown exponentially, really? That's quite a big jump, no?
Yeah, it is a big jump. So actually, from the census in 2016, we found that there is 140 more thousand people that speak Spanish at home in Australia. So
Mm-hmm.
they're coming from Latin America, but also from Spain. And there's quite a few that in terms of proportion, there's not much. And if you compare with the Mandarin or Arabic speakers,
Mm-hmm.
well, there's no comparison, but still there's quite a lot of Spanish speakers. I would
Mm.
say the reasons can be, numerous, but I would say one of the reasons is that the efforts that the Australian government has made to bring skilled migrants
The
from
students, yeah?
different part of the world, and also yes, the international students. There's a lot of international students coming from Chile, from actually
Colombia.
Colombia,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and Argentina. So there are a lot of people, a lot of students included in that list.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's 0.6% of the population, which is quite a high number, about 140, 150, and that may have changed in the last 4 years. That this is the most
Yes.
recent statistics. Okay, and what about in Victoria? What's happening here?
Yeah, so particularly in Victoria, there's a lot of people. The total is 35,000 people living in Victoria. Most of them just speak English very well, but basically Spanish is the main language in they speak at home.
Mm-hmm. Because as far as migration to Australia from Spanish-speaking countries, I think that used to be quite limited. So people did come here from Spain, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but they're now kind of elderly, and the newest influx is just younger people. So, um, skilled immigrants and students, that would be the bulk of who's coming here, yeah, right now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that right now. So, surprisingly, the biggest Spanish-speaking community, because we cannot say there's only one community, there's many more. The biggest one will be Chile,
I find
with
that
20.
really surprising. Yeah. How
Yeah,
come? Is it why so
that's
many
in
from there?
terms that's in terms of number.
Right.
I would say the first reason is the proximity we have with Chile. So that's because the flight is only 14 hours, only
Only
one.
14 hours, yes.
Yes, only one stop directly from Santiago de Chile to Melbourne or to Sydney. So a lot of migrants coming from Chile in the 1960 because of the political issues they
Right. So they were
had.
refugees, yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then very recently from Colombia, a lot of international students, Colombian, coming, very young people.
Mm-hmm.
So around almost 19,000 people right now from the census. And then
Mm.
followed by Spain, Argentina, El Salvador, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela, which is the country I'm coming from,
Mm-hmm.
only 5,000 people.
Amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of the age, very young population. The median age between all these eight communities, I would say 44 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And the youngest will be Colombians. The median age is 33 years old. Pretty
Mm-hmm.
young. Yeah.
Okay.
And just to finalize this part, yeah, where are they located? All the Spanish-speaking communities. So most of them are located in Victoria, in the north and west part of the state, followed by the southeast part of Victoria, and then the east, yeah.
Cool.
That's from the census.
Okay.
Yeah, and then to finalize on this, so if you ask me, or if you ask Spanish speakers, which Spanish or type of Spanish you should choose when translating your content, well, it depends on basically the content, but there's no neutral variety of Spanish. Yeah, there's just different variation of Spanish. But when you translate your content, I would say first you need to consider the target culture, yeah, your targeting. So basically, if you know your target, because you should know your target, if you know most of them are Latin Americans, you should adapt somehow your text or your content to that. But if you cannot, if you are not able to know your target culture, you can use words that are most recognizable to the majority of Spanish speakers or your target audience.
Okay, and you rely on your translators, of course, to
Yes.
give you that polish, I guess. Was that the last slide, Andrea, or there's more?
Yes, that's one more. Just to summarize the 5 things you should know about Spanish. So Spanish is in the top 10 of languages spoken at home, being in the position 8. Then the Chileans are the biggest Spanish-speaking community in Australia, followed by the Colombians and the Spanish from Spain. So the Spanish communities is a very young population in Australia. As I said before, there's no neutral or universal variety of Spanish. And the text coming from the English, if you want to translate it to Spanish, it can expand by 25% or more.
Now, I have a whole heap of questions, Andrea. I know that we've gone over time, but I need to ask you these questions because we've received them. So, and of course, people can reach out afterwards. You did mention a Spanish-speaking country in Africa. What is it? What's the country?
Yeah, so that's the Equatorial Guinea.
Okay.
Equatorial Guinea in Africa, yes.
Okay, and I know, because I know you, but somebody asked about how engaged the Spanish-speaking community is in the context of things like community radio. So I know that you've had quite a bit of involvement with the community here through your previous job and through voluntary association. So, you know, in terms of engagement, is it an easy community to engage? And, you know, we can't be stereotypical because that you know depends is the answer. But could you tell me a bit more about how the Spanish speaking community here in Australia engages and what kind of things they like? How do they communicate? Is a lot of it happening on social media? Are there newspapers, radio station, that kind of thing?
Well, it depends on the community, but as a whole, we are very cohesive group and community. Let me tell you an example. I'm part of the Melbourne Ethnic Community Radio Station as a volunteer. I volunteered there as a broadcaster, and I'm part of the Spanish group. And we're about 300 people being part of this radio. Yeah, Spanish speakers all. And we are not coming only from Latin America, but also there's a lot of Spanish community. Spanish speakers coming from Spain. And although there's a clear difference between Spain and Latin America, there's still similarities, and we are very engaged to each other. So we understand each other very well, and we share a lot of traditions, similarities. So that's why we can share as a group, as a community in the radio. And that's happening for different other organizations that are that they have a Spanish origin. So there's a lot of associations and institutions that are most of them are not-for-profit institutions that are helping Latin American refugees, but also, Spanish refugees and migrants. Very cohesive community. How we communicate? Well, there's very different channels, but at the moment, because we are a very young population, we communicate mainly through social media. So basically Facebook and also Instagram. If you want to reach out to the Spanish speaking communities, it's easy to find a lot of groups in Facebook. If you want to reach Colombians, there's a group for Colombians. If you want to reach Chileans, there's a group for Chileans. But also, if you want to reach Latin people, there is one for Latin American people. So that's basically it.
It's very dynamic and very engaged community, generally speaking, and it sounds like it makes efforts at like things like education is really important. Being curious about the world, and I think Spanish speakers are also well traveled. Like they, we're generalizing here, of course, because there's the other side of the coin, and that is communities that are perhaps older or international students at the moment that are here don't have it that easy for all kinds of reasons that we won't have time to talk about. But I wanted to encourage everybody that, and I have lots of other questions that we don't have time for, I'm sorry. Please feel free to reach out to Andreita.
Andreita.
I'll get it right. If you want any information about the Spanish speaking community in Australia, about Spanish translations, about communicating with the Spanish community, we're very, very privileged to have Andrea on board. So on that note, I wanted to thank you for preparing this. And I know that you always are behind the scenes person. So I'm very proud of you that we can see your face today, and hopefully we can get more information about this amazing language, because it's in top 10 or top 8. So it's a very key, important language in Australia, but generally speaking. And the other thing I'll say just right at the end is that it's I've said that already, but it's a relatively easy language to learn for English speakers. So we would encourage you to reach out to Andrea, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.